Introduce our speaker, Dr. Mark Cheathem, who will be talking about James K. Polk and the presidential election of 1844. Dr. Cheathem is professor of history at Cumberland University, and he also serves as the project director for the papers of Martin Van Buren. He's the author or editor of 9 books, and he's brought some of his books with him tonight. So if you'd like to purchase some of them, we have those available at the back table. We also have the most issue of the quarterly available for free. So if you missed yours or if you need another copy to pass on to somebody else, please feel free to take one. So he's won several awards already for Andrew Jackson Southerner and the Coming of Democracy Presidential Campaigning in the Age of Jackson. His most recent book and the topic of his subject tonight was a finalist for the 2023 Tennessee History Book Award. So with that, we'd like to invite Dr. Cheathem, and we're going to come ahead and come up here, and we're going to try to get to your slides. So let's go. We can try. Okay, if I put that down there. Okay. All right. Thank you for telling us about, I'm trying to get you to where we, from beginning. This is so hard. Slideshow. There we go. From beginning. There we. All right.
If any of you here or at home are educators, you understand how difficult it is to do Zoom. So awkward transitions are just normal in a post-COVID world, unfortunately. Thank you all for having me, both here and for those of you who are online. I appreciate your time, even though you're probably here more for the business meeting than for me. Hopefully you'll learn something more about James K. Polk over the next few minutes. Before I start, I want to echo David's comments about Ann Toplovich. Ann was someone I knew from graduate school in the late 90s, early 2000s, up until her death. She was someone I knew professionally and personally, and she is someone that I think we're all going to sorely miss. So I'm going to echo David's comments on that. So the topic of my talk is, who is James K. Polk? A phrase that purportedly was something that was commonly uttered in 1844 when Polk won the Democratic Party's nomination and then became president. What I discovered was that it wasn't nearly as frequent as people thought or think today. It was something that really seems to be more of a myth created after the fact, talking about how Polk emerged from nowhere, no one had ever heard of him, and he became this phenomenon, this political phenomenon who ascended to the presidency. That's not quite exactly how things happened. So I'm going to, over the next few minutes, talk about how the campaign of 1844 developed, who were the major players, and then what were the outcomes of the election. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a running start by talking about the previous presidential election, the election of 1840, in which William Henry Harrison, the Whig candidate, defeated the sitting president, Martin Van Buren. Harrison was a War of 1812 hero. And the Whigs had really kind of taken a page from the Democratic playbook. The Democrats, as you may know, had nominated Andrew Jackson, a military hero, and that had proven successful. And so the Whigs decided to replicate that in 1840, and they were also successful. Unfortunately for the Whigs, Harrison died 1 month into office. And so what looked to be a tremendous triumph turned into a little bit of a conundrum for the party. The vice president, Harrison's vice president, John Tyler from Virginia, took over for Harrison after he died. Unfortunately, John Tyler was someone who was not really a full-fledged Whig. He had been placed on the ticket as someone who would appeal to Southerners in particular. Within 6 months, John Tyler was proving so unpopular that mobs were marching to the White House demanding that he come out and greet them. He was so unpopular with his own party, the Whig Party, that the Whig Party essentially read him out of the party. So going from the high of having Harrison as president in March of 1841 to the low by September, October of that same year, the Whigs were in disarray. And so all of that provides an opportunity, perhaps, for the Democrats, their opponents, to rise to the occasion and win back the White House. The Whigs are not going to give up without a fight, however. As the 1844 campaign approaches, the Whigs have a number of different options that they're thinking about as far as their presidential nomination. John McClain was one choice. He was a Supreme Court justice who, over the decades, dabbled, dipped his toe into, hinted at the fact that he might be interested in becoming president. Democrats and Whigs both had looked at him as a potential candidate. Daniel Webster, who was a senator, a Whig senator, was also someone that the Whigs considered. He had a lot of experience, but there were intra-party divisions within the Whig Party that really kind of kept Webster from achieving the nomination of the Whigs in 1844. Winfield Scott was another potential presidential candidate.
Sure. Quick,
Yep.
we've got the sharing a different screen. You want to verify with Nikki that changed it?
Again, in a post-COVID world, this was not unusual. So Winfield Scott was the third potential presidential candidate that the Whigs could have turned to. Winfield Scott was a military hero like Harrison, so that was something that was attractive to some Whig Party leaders. He was someone that the Whigs had actually considered in 1840 before turning to Harrison. Winfield Scott, however, had some issues. He was quite arrogant and was honestly a little bit unapologetic about it. And so Whigs were a little bit unsure about selecting him. By the time the Whigs met in May of 1844 in Baltimore, they had pretty much decided that they were not going to choose any of these three. They were actually going to choose the natural choice. Let's see if I can. There we go. They chose Henry Clay. Henry Clay was the elder statesman of the Whig Party. He had been really the leader of the anti-Jackson, anti-democratic opposition for 2 decades at this point. He was someone who was really the natural choice. If the Whigs wanted a sure bet on someone who could carry them into the White House again, Henry Clay seemed like a natural choice. So when the Whig delegates met in Baltimore in early May of 44, they overwhelmingly chose Clay and proceeded to line up their campaign against the person that they thought would be the Democratic Party's nominee. The Democrats had a number of choices as well. The first person they could have chosen, and the person who was the front runner really above all others going into the Democratic National Convention, was the man you see in the middle, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren had constructed the Democratic Party in the mid-1820s, along with Andrew Jackson, John C. Calhoun, and others. He had served in Jackson's cabinet, had served as Jackson's vice president, had taken that experience with him to win the presidency in 1836, had served 1 term, and as I already spoiled for you, he lost at the end of that term in 1840. He lost for really a variety of reasons, but the major reason was the United States went through a very serious economic depression during Van Buren's presidency, almost from the very start of his presidency. And Van Buren's response to that was something that the Whigs were able to capitalize on in the 1840 campaign to their advantage. But there were a lot of Democrats who looked at Van Buren and thought, just like Clay, this is our best shot of getting back into the White House. This is a man who has a lot of experience. This guy has really been the standard bearer, besides Andrew Jackson, of our party. And so there were a lot of Democrats going into the Democratic National Convention who thought Van Buren would be the choice of the party. There were some other options as well, and I'm not going to cover all the options, but I want to point out 2 other potential front runners for the Democrats. On your left is Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass had also been in Jackson's cabinet. He was someone who had been a diplomat. Fortunately for him, he had been away out of the country on a diplomatic mission during the economic depression that Van Buren wrestled with and during the 1840 campaign. So there were some Democrats who looked at Cass and thought, this is someone who is untainted by the struggles that we've had in recent years, and so maybe we should go with him. And then on your right is Richard M. Johnson. Richard M. Johnson was an intriguing choice. He was also a War of 1812 military hero. Purportedly, he was the man who had killed the great Shawnee leader Tecumseh during the War of 1812. Johnson had taken that reputation, whether it was earned or not, and had used it to his advantage to go into Congress. He had also been Mark Van Buren's vice president. So he was someone who many Democrats probably would have been comfortable with, particularly if it looked like the Whigs were going to nominate someone who was a military hero themselves. But there was an issue with Johnson, and this had been a long time issue. The issue was that he had been in an open relationship with several enslaved women, living as husband and wife with one of those women, Julia Chin, who birthed two daughters by him. And so the issue with Johnson was not necessarily that he was engaged in an interracial relationship with an enslaved woman. That was not uncommon in the South at this time. The issue was that he was so open about it, that he acted as if Julia Chin was his wife. He openly presented their two daughters as into white society. And so there were a lot of Southern Democrats in particular who'd been uncomfortable with him on the ticket in 36 when he and Van Buren won. And so 8 years later, that discomfort had not gone away, particularly because Johnson had continued to engage in other relationships after Julia had passed away. But these are some of the major frontrunners. Again, there are other people I'm not mentioning: John C. Calhoun, Levi Woodbury, Charles Stewart, who was a naval commodore. But these were really the ones that the Democrats were looking at going into their national convention, which was held at the end of May 1844 in Baltimore as well. The Democratic National Convention did not turn out the way that a lot of people expected. Most people thought maybe it wouldn't be as unanimous as the Whig endorsement of Clay, but most Democrats probably thought Van Buren would come out as the nominee. Instead, there was some maneuvering that occurred early on in the convention that set a higher standard for getting the nomination. So instead of requiring a majority of the votes to win the presidential nomination, some anti-Van Buren delegates maneuvered so that it required a 2/3 majority instead of a simple majority. And so what that meant was, while Van Buren started out in the balloting with a majority, with a simple majority, he did not have a 2/3 majority. And as each ballot continued to come across and be counted, he began to lose votes. So it was very clear as the balloting began, Van Buren was not going to be the nominee. So there's some scrambling that takes place, both on the convention floor and then especially behind the scenes, to try to figure out who else can we turn to. The critical delegates who are involved in this maneuvering are 3 Tennesseans and 1 Massachusetts delegate. The 3 Tennesseans were Cave Johnson, Gideon J. Pillow, and Andrew Jackson Donaldson. Cave Johnson was a very close friend of James K. Polk, essentially acted as his campaign manager during this era. Gideon J. Pillow was also a very close friend of Polk. And if you know anything about Gideon J. Pillow, he was happy to tell you how successful and how important he was. And after the convention's over, he does that quite frequently. And then Andrew Jackson Donaldson was one of the nephews of Andrew Jackson. In fact, if you've been to the Hermitage, which probably most of you in the room have, his home, Tulip Grove, is on the same property as today's Hermitage. So these 3 men go into the convention committed to supporting the party. Some of them, like Donaldson, were committed Van Burenites, but they also had other options in their back pocket. Some of them talked about maybe nominating Silas Wright Jr. of New York, who was very similar ideologically to Van Buren, but didn't have some of the baggage Van Buren had. But all of them had some inclination to support a guy by the name of James K. Polk. And so these three delegates in particular, in conjunction with George Bancroft of Massachusetts, worked together during the balloting at night to try to figure out how do we find a consensus candidate that we all can agree on who's going to be able to beat Henry Clay and the Whigs. And so by the time this first 7 ballots are cast, Van Buren's bleeding support, Lewis Cass is gaining momentum. When the 8th ballot rolls around, James K. Polk emerges on the ballot for the first time due to these 4 delegates. And then on the 9th ballot, Polk was nominated unanimously by the Democratic Party. So to anyone looking at the convention, they probably were surprised that Polk was the nominee. He had not been a major contender for the presidency going into the convention. He was someone that people talked about for the vice presidency, certainly, but not for the presidency. However, the mythology that Polk is some political unknown simply does not hold water. If you don't know James K. Polk's career, he had served in the Tennessee state legislature. He had then served in the U.S. House for 14 years. The last 4 of those years were spent as Speaker of the House. So speakers of the House typically are not political unknowns. He had resigned from Congress, had come back to Tennessee to run for the governorship in 1839, had won the governorship, was talked about as a potential running mate with Van Buren in 1840 during that election. So again, Polk is someone whose political career from the mid-1820s until 1841 seemed to be one of a very high trajectory pointing towards the presidency, particularly because he was someone who gained the nickname Young Hickory. And again, those of you in the room and at home probably are familiar with Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. So someone bearing the nickname Young Hickory was a signal that this was a promising Democratic star for the future. However, in 1841, things began to change for Polk. He lost a very close gubernatorial election to Lean Jimmy Jones from Lebanon, where I'm living now. And then in 1843, he lost again in another close election to Lean Jimmy Jones. So someone whose political trajectory seemed to be headed potentially toward the presidency, all of a sudden, over a 2-year span, seemed to be in a tailspin. However, what's important to understand is that Polk and his supporters, Cave Johnson, Gideon Pillow, Andrew Jackson Donaldson, and others, continued to keep his name out there in a positive way. And in doing so, they positioned him for the vice presidency in 1844. And when it was clear that none of the frontrunners were going to be able to pull together a 2/3 majority, Polk became the consensus second choice of a number of different factions at the convention, despite the fact that he had lost his last 2 elections. So it's really a remarkable feat that Polk pulls off in some ways, or his supporters really pull off. But it's not the efforts of a political unknown. It is someone who was politically experienced. It's someone who knew the ins and outs of both state politics and national politics and understood what it took to be in a position to win an election. There were some other candidates in the 1844 election, and so I want to mention them. We're not going to go into too much detail about them, but I want to mention them because I think a lot of people don't know that it's not just Polk versus Clay in 44. The first candidate is someone who we already talked about, John Tyler. John Tyler, even though he's a president without a party, up until the end of August of 1844, stays in the race. He wants to be president on his own. And then he eventually withdraws from the race, partly at the behest of Andrew Jackson and some of his supporters. A second third-party candidate is an abolitionist by the name of James G. Birney. James G. Birney really has a remarkable political story that I think more people need to know more about. Birney started out as an enslaver, someone who owned a number of enslaved people, a number of enslaved African Americans, and over the course of several years went from someone who owned other human beings to being a committed abolitionist who was opposed to slavery and argued for racial equality. In part, his conversion was literally a conversion, a religious conversion, where his wife, over several years, had talked to him about converting to Christianity. Um, James Birney eventually does that, and in doing so, he sees the evil of slavery and the inhumanity of slavery, and then begins to take action to rid himself of that evil institution, but then also to try to spread the word that more Americans needed to do that as well. James G. Birney would be a presidential nominee in 1840 on the Liberty Party ticket. Did not do quite well in that election. But going into the 1844 election, the Liberty Party is much more organized, and they have made a decision that they are not going to compromise on who their candidate is. So there was a moment when the Liberty Party members, or the leaders at least, talked about, do we want to make a pragmatic decision going into 1844? Do we want to throw our weight to one party or the other based on their views on slavery? The party leaders decided not to do that. They remained committed to James G. Birney as their presidential candidate, as someone who was unequivocally opposed to slavery. And so that's an important thread I want you to keep in the back of your mind, because I'll come back to it in just a minute. And then there's a third party candidate that most people are astonished to hear ran for the presidency in 1844. Joseph Smith, the prophet, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormonism for those who are non-church members. Joseph Smith became a presidential candidate in 1844 after he and his council received a vision, a word from God, that God wanted Joseph Smith to bring his religion to the White House, to merge Mormonism with democracy, and to put together a theodemocracy, or a theocratic government based on the principles of Mormonism as Joseph Smith understood them. Joseph Smith and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will begin to put together a campaign. They will begin to take missionaries who are going out and trying to convert Americans to Mormonism, charging them and additional church members with going out and beginning to campaign for Smith as president. Smith, however, is never going to make it to the end of the campaign. He's actually going to be assassinated, not because of his politics, but because of inter-church fights over a number of different things, including Smith's political practices in the Mormon city of Nauvoo, the seat of government for the church, and then also his endorsement of controversial religious practices such as plural marriage, as church members called it at the time, or as non-church members would call it, polygamy. So Smith will die at the hands of murderers in June of 1844, and so will not make it to the end of the campaign. So to kind of reset ourselves here before we move to the issues very quickly and then talk about the results. The two main tickets are the Democratic Party with James K. Polk at the top of the ticket. The Democrats had selected George Dallas of Pennsylvania for the vice presidency. Dallas was from Pennsylvania, which is a very critical economic state for the Democrats in terms of economic policy. The Whigs, again, had selected Henry Clay to kind of balance Henry Clay's reputation as a gambler and a womanizer and an alcoholic. The Whigs chose Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey, who had a reputation as a straight-laced, stick-in-the-mud Christian, moral man. So Frelinghuysen was kind of the Mike Pence of the 1844 Whig ticket, if you want to think about it that way. So these are the two main tickets, and these are the two main candidates for president moving forward. The campaign issues going into 1844, most people expected to be traditional issues like the economy, particularly because most people expected Van Buren to be the Democratic Party candidate. And so the Whigs were more than happy to talk about the economy, banks and tariffs and those kinds of things. There was also the issue of political corruption. So the Democrats were anticipating Henry Clay perhaps being the candidate. And so when it came to personal corruption, They could point back to how Clay had stolen the election from Jackson in 1824, from their perspective. When it came to personal character, again, the Democrats are salivating that Clay is a perfect candidate for them to attack because of what I just mentioned about his personal character. But even though these issues are part of the campaign, there are some emerging issues that become important in 1844. So those three issues are nativism, a growing anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States that had really been developing over the past decade as Irish and Catholic immigrants started to migrate in large numbers to the United States. It caused a lot of consternation, particularly in northern cities where most of these immigrants were coming into. So that is an important part of the 44 campaign that probably a lot of people didn't expect. Slavery is also an emerging issue. Not that slavery had not been important prior to this, because it certainly had. If you go back to the 1800 election between Jefferson and John Adams, slavery had been part of that election. You go to 1828 with Jackson and John Quincy Adams, slavery had been part of that campaign. So it's not that slavery was a new issue, but it was becoming a much more important issue. And it was becoming a much more important issue in large part because of the last issue, westward expansion. Specifically, the idea that the United States would annex the independent Republic of Texas. So Texas, and we're Tennesseans, right? So we should know this. Texas had won its independence in large part due to some Tennesseans during its revolution in the mid-1830s. It had existed as an independent republic since that time, but during those years, Texas and the United States had had discussions about perhaps having Texas join the United States. By the end of 1843, early 1844, the groundwork was being laid for that to occur. And so as that reality becomes much more significant as the campaign begins, you have Americans who are arguing about what is the role of Texas coming into the Union? Is it going to be a slave state? Is it going to be multiple slave states? Is there anything we can do to prevent slavery from becoming part of or remaining part of Texas when it comes into the Union? So slavery and westward expansion, specifically Texas annexation, really become intertwined during the campaign in ways that highlight slavery's importance as a presidential campaign issue. So the results of the election see James K. Polk win. It's a close election. If you look at the popular vote, which doesn't matter, right? I mean, we know the popular vote doesn't matter, but that tells you how close the vote is. Okay. And then if you look at the electoral vote, you're like, okay, Polk wins 62%. So, I mean, that kind of seems convincing until you start digging into the details. And I'm not going to dig too deep into the details, and some of you are going to zone out like my students the minute you see this slide, and that's okay. But I just want to highlight for you how close this election was, and to point out that that margin of victory with the electoral vote was not that significant. So if you look at states that Polk won that were extremely close, states like Georgia, states like Louisiana, states like New York, not only are the number of votes very small between him and Clay, but look at the slight percentages that separate the candidates. Okay. And then if you look at Clay and you look at the states that he won by these very slim margins, you can see there were a lot of electoral votes at play that turned on very few popular votes. Tennessee, for example, which consistently during this era goes to the Whig Party, much to Andrew Jackson's consternation. I mean, Jackson gets angry about lots of things, but he's really angry every time the presidential election goes to the Whig Party. If you look at Tennessee, the number of votes separating Clay and Polk is 113. That's significant, significant. So every vote did matter, right? Every vote mattered in this election. So when you, if I can go back for just a second, if you look at this and say, well, yeah, it looks like a comfortable margin, and then you look at the bottom and you see 90 of Polk's votes were by pretty slim margins, 46 of Clay's votes were by very slim margins. That tells you how much is in flux, even up to the final days of the election. So heading into the home stretch here, thank you for staying with me. What are the factors that influence Polk's victory? How is it that the Democrats and James K. Polk, not a neophyte, but unexpected as a nominee, what are the factors that allow Polk and the Whigs to win? I'm sorry, Polk and the Democrats to win. Well, one of them is Texas annexation. And as I was doing research for this book, I went into the book and into my research thinking, oh, Texas annexation is the key issue, which I think probably it was. And it benefited the Democrats and it benefited Polk. But in reality, it was much harder for me to make that case than I expected. Because in certain parts of the country, in the South, for example, I think annexation definitely does help James K. Polk. But there are other parts of the country where it doesn't. Ohio, for example, I think annexation probably harmed Polk. But overall, I think that annexation helped Polk and the Democrats, particularly because Martin Van Buren, one of the reasons that he had not won the nomination was because he had come out against the immediate annexation of Texas. And so, as I thought about it, if Van Buren had been the Democratic nominee and had taken an anti-annexation stand, I think he would have bled Southern votes. Southern Democrats were always suspicious of Van Buren. They didn't quite trust him. He's a Yankee and we don't know. And so he was someone that I think Southern Democrats probably would have abandoned if he had been the Democratic Party's nominee. So when I say that Texas annexation is one of the keys to Polk's victory, I think it's more because Polk is so pro-annexation and Van Buren would have been so anti-annexation. So that's part of the calculation there. Secondly, the Liberty Party vote in New York, I think, is to some extent a factor, but not quite the way historians have talked about it. So historians in the past have talked about New York being the swing state, that New York, 5,000 votes separate Clay and Polk. Those votes were essentially covered by the Liberty Party. So if the Liberty Party had not nominated Birney, or if they had simply decided to go with the lesser of two evils and had voted for Clay, then Clay would have won New York and won the presidency. That is not what I found. What I found was that because the Liberty Party had made the principled choice of sticking with Birney, if the party had not nominated Birney, they simply would not have voted. And so it did not make a difference whether or not the Liberty Party votes covered New York's votes or not when it came to Clay. And so it's hard to suss this out, I'll be honest, because there's no polling, there's no one going around, and we can't trust polls anyway, right? That's what I hear. So there's no polling, so there's no way to really calculate that. But based on the documentary evidence that we have, I think it's pretty clear that Liberty Party voters, if they had a choice between Polk and Clay, would have chosen neither, right? So having Birney there gave them someone to vote for, whereas they just simply would not have voted up. Thirdly, nativism. I mentioned that earlier. Nativism is key in this election in the northern cities in particular. And you can look at it a couple of ways. The Whigs make the argument that these immigrants come in and they're illegally voting for Polk and the Democrats. You can look at it from the Democratic perspective. These are people who are coming in. They're now gaining voting rights. And so, of course, we're going to appeal to them and get them to vote for us. Regardless, the flare-up of nativism plays a role in northern cities, probably to the Democrats' advantage, because the Democrats were pro-immigrant and they use that to their advantage in drawing in these voters. And this definitely will be a major issue for the next decade or so in American presidential politics. Fourthly, and I promise you I'm almost done. Thank you for your patience. Fourthly is something that I think a lot of people underestimated, including myself, that in New York, yes, you have the Liberty Party votes floating out there, but to me, there's something more significant. There's a popular Democratic gubernatorial candidate by the name of Silas Wright Jr., who uh, who gets more votes than James K. Polk and probably pulled Polk's support up in New York. So oftentimes when we think about presidential politics, we think about presidential candidates pulling in voters to local and state elections. I think in this case, probably the opposite happened, that you had New Yorkers who were New York Democrats who were upset about Van Buren, their guy, not getting the nomination, who maybe are on the fence about voting at all, who are pulled into the polling places because Silas Wright Jr. was so popular in his home state. And so I think in this case, you have the reverse happening where Silas Wright Jr.'s statewide election is pulling in voters who are then voting also for Polk and perhaps putting him over the top in New York and thus gaining him the presidency. And then lastly, you have something called cultural politics. And this is something that historians have talked about for a number of decades, but I don't think we've done a good job of communicating to public audiences, general audiences, what this is. So cultural politics is basically campaigning like we think of it today. So symbols and rallies and songs and cartoons, maybe memes for the younger generations today, but I mean, things, like today we wear hats and we have bumper stickers and those kinds of things. That type of campaigning at the presidential level is emerging during the Jacksonian period. And in 1840, the Whigs had used that to their advantage. They had honed their campaigning almost to perfection to help William Henry Harrison win the election. And the Democrats had not done as good of a job. Well, the Democrats learned their lesson. And 4 years later, in 44, they have honed their campaign tactics to almost perfection. And so they're at least equivalent with the Whig in leveling the playing field when it comes to enticing voters to come out to vote using food and alcohol, and encouraging voters to go listen to candidates who are saying Polk is the best presidential candidate that you could vote for and those types of things. So getting the base energized and getting new voters invested in the Democratic Party is something that Democrats had failed to do to a great extent in 1840. They do not fail in 1844. And so I think that probably makes a difference in helping Polk to win. So coon, short for raccoon, of course, was a term that was used to depict the frontier spirit or Westerners, and that was applied to Henry Clay. That was one of his nicknames, the Old Coon. And so by treeing the coons, you have Polk and Jackson and other Democrats who treed the coons, which is a good thing if you're a hunter. And so this is a pro-democratic, pro-Polk political cartoon depicting that activity. Good question. So what are the consequences? And I'm going to end with this. So there are a lot of different consequences we could talk about, but I think the two main consequences are, as Polk becomes president, he continues to look westward. He is really robbed of a little bit of glory because John Tyler served out his term, and he's so miffed that right before he leaves office, he signs the annexation treaty with Texas, so that he steals that spotlight from Polk, even though the process is completed under Polk. But Polk continues to look westward, and he looks at Texas, and he looks at the border between Texas and Mexico. And in 1846, he essentially provokes Mexico into a war that turns into a 2-year war that gains the United States most of what we today call the American Southwest. And in doing so, that sets off debates, not just among voters and among the general public, but it sets off a lot of debate within Congress about what do we do with this new land, particularly when it comes to slavery. Is slavery going to exist there? Will it not exist? Can it exist? And so these debates fire off and accentuate a lot of the divisions between not just Whigs and Democrats, but also within each party. And so in lots of ways, the 1844 election, one of the major consequences, I think, is a step down the road to the American Civil War in 1861. So I'm going to stop there. I've said plenty, probably more than you